we are still working through 1 Kings, but one of the challenges that I've been wrestling with when we do these studies and you're looking at these Old Testament passages, and a lot of them are pretty familiar passages, but the thing that I've always wrestled with is trying to look at this and really, rather than reading through it and going, I remember Rehoboam. Yeah, I remember Rehoboam. He was the guy down south. He was kind of a good guy. And then there was Jeroboam. Oh, he's the bad guy. And just kind of these general things you remember. And one of the problems we have in the church is illustrated by something that you've seen probably, at least I think it is, in the public eye over the last year or two. And it's related to this thing that we do in our country whenever you have an official event, like or a baseball game or a football game, and we have this tradition, which is fitting to be talking about today, called the Star Spangled Banner, the national anthem that we sing. And in the last year or two, there have been the big news when some famous person who has been asked to sing the national anthem blows it terribly. And you've got to stop and think and say, oh, why does that happen? These are people whose business is singing and knowing the words to much bigger songs than the national anthem. And is it, well, some say, well, they had a few too many cocktails before they stepped out there, and that may have been the case. But still, these are professionals that make their living singing songs. Why is it so hard to remember the verses to the national anthem? And I'm going to suggest to you that the reason that it's so hard to remember how they go is because we don't know what they mean. They're just words in a tune that are familiar to us. And when you start singing it, if somebody's leading you, your brain just goes, oh yeah, right to the words. And we really don't know what the national anthem is all about. How did it come about? What's the history of it? When we sing that song, what do those words mean? Oh, say, can you see? Why are we seeing? Why do we care if we see what's been going on? So I have for you this morning a short 7-minute and 45-second little clip that you'll get to watch because we have this neat tool right here that explains in a fairly concise manner how we came about having the national anthem and the history that went behind, that drove that thing. And my hope is that will help you to see the same application of how we look at Scripture and the familiar passages we deal with. And also that when you sing the national anthem, it won't be just the same old tune and song. When you hear it, it will have much more meaning. So if we can make it work.
Let me find the right switch here.
The War of 1812
there we go.
is sometimes called the Second American Revolution because it was fought over promises made but not kept by the British at the end of the Revolutionary War. It was an especially vicious war, for Great Britain had been humiliated by their first defeat at the hands of what they considered a fledgling nation. And now, determined not to have a second embarrassment, in the War of 1812, they set out to deliver a convincing message of their military superiority. By August of 1814, the British had entered Washington, D.C., rallied the American troops, they chased President and Mrs. Madison from the city, and then they burned down the government buildings, including the White House and the U.S. Capitol building, the very symbolic center of the American nation. The British then headed for Baltimore, at that time the nation's third largest population center, to attack Fort McHenry, which was located on a peninsula guarding the city. That fort had been named for James McHenry, a military officer under Generals Washington and Lafayette during the Revolution. McHenry later became a signer of the U.S. Constitution and then the Secretary of War for Presidents George Washington and John Adams. The British understood that the destruction of Fort McHenry would be another demoralizing defeat for the Americans. Now, Major George Armistead, the commander of Fort McHenry, had arrived at his post a year earlier. He understood that at some point in the war, because of the strategic importance of that fort, that he would probably be attacked by the British. So in June of 1813, he had commissioned Mary Pickersgill, a widow who made flags for ships, to make two flags for the fort. The smaller flag, which was still a very large 25 feet long and 17 feet wide, was called a storm flag, to be flown in inclement weather. The larger flag, which was the garrison flag, was an impressive 42 feet long and 30 feet wide. Armistead had wanted that flag to be so large that it would be impossible for the British to miss it from a distance. He didn't want them to lose their way and miss the fort. So when the British approached a year later, in September of 1814, they first attempted to take the fort by land, but that assault was resoundingly repulsed by the tenacious Americans. 16 British warships then positioned themselves in the harbor around the exposed fort to begin a devastating bombardment and force its surrender. However, at the same time that military preparations were being made for this massive assault, a relatively small and otherwise insignificant humanitarian effort was simultaneously underway. As the British had marched from Washington through Maryland and on toward the fort, they had seized leading citizens along the way and carried them off as hostages, placing them as prisoners on board British warships. One of those hostages was a Dr. William Beans. Some of Beans' many friends prevailed on a young Baltimore attorney and on John C. Skinner, the U.S. government liaison agent, to approach the British and plead for Beans' freedom. The two men successfully negotiated his release, but since the British were about to launch their attack on the fort, all three were detained and placed on board a British ship to be released at the end of the battle. Early in the morning of September the 12th, 1814, the British launched their attack. It was raining and wet, so the Americans were flying the smaller storm flag. The British, with their superior weaponry, placed their ships outside the range of the American guns, and then they launched a high-trajectory projectile attack against the fort, hurling thousands of cannonballs and scores of rockets down upon the Americans and an unremitting hail of fire and hot shrapnel. Throughout that full day, during that night, and across the next day, the bombardment continued as Dr. Beans and his two friends watched helplessly. After dark, on the evening of the second day, the firing finally ceased. The silence was deafening, and the suspense was agonizing. Beans and his friends couldn't tell if the firing had stopped because the fort had fallen or because the British had given up. Rising well before dawn on the morning of the 14th, the three Americans pressed tightly against the railing of the ship, straining eagerly to see any indication of what might have befallen the fort. When they had last seen the fort the night before as darkness fell, the American flag had still been flying. But was it still flying? The young Baltimore attorney held a telescope tight against his eye, searching to see whether the American flag still flew or whether a British flag was now flying in its place. As he waited, he pulled a letter from his pocket and on the back of that envelope began to scribble an inspired poem voicing his thoughts about what he was experiencing at that very moment. He began that poem with a simple question that had tormented his own soul as he peered through the early morning darkness. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's and last night's last gleaming? Could anyone tell what had happened? Did anyone know the outcome? He soon saw the answer for himself. The fort had not surrendered. In fact, the Americans had taken down the smaller storm flag and raised the massive garrison flag, and it now waved proudly in the morning light atop the 90-foot flagpole, while the Americans inside the fort played Yankee Doodle and fired their guns in celebration. The Americans had taken the worst the British could give and had not been defeated. Just 3 months later, the British signed a peace treaty to end that war. But on that momentous morning, after the flag was seen waving in the breeze, the three Americans were finally released from the British ship. And on their way back to shore, Francis Scott Key continued to ponder what he had just experienced. Later, in his hotel room, he completed the poem, penning 4 full verses, the last of which summarized what patriotic Americans so strongly felt. Praise the power that hath made and preserved us a nation. Then conquer we must when our cause it is just, and this be our motto, in God is our trust. His poem was soon printed, and it was sung, ironically, to the melody of a popular British tune. Known as the Star-Spangled Banner, By the 1890s, the military required that it be played at the raising and lowering of the flag. In 1916, President Woodrow Wilson ordered it played at all military ceremonies, and on March 3, 1931, President Herbert Hoover signed a federal law making the Star-Spangled Banner America's official national anthem. And today, that song and its words remain no less stirring to Americans than when it was first penned some 2 centuries ago.
Now you know the rest of the story. So suddenly the words start having some meaning, don't they?
Well, we've all heard the old story about the Mexican that came up from Mexico. His friends took him to the first baseball game. And when he got back, they asked him how he liked it. They said it was so great, they were so polite. The first thing they did, this guy stood up and said, "Oh, say, can you see?"
Jose. Yes. Yeah, Jose, yeah. Let's make sure he was okay. So how many of you know and have seen all 4 verses of the Star-Spangled Banner?
I've seen it. I've seen them.
Seen them. So I'm impressed some of you actually knew there were 4. I didn't realize there were that many. So today, you will get the chance to, if you have not seen them. I'll just let you just pass those. You all get to have a copy of the Star-Spangled Banner, all 4 verses of the poem, just for fun, in celebration of the 4th that's coming up. I thought it might be fun just to take a moment to read it and see what was going on in this man's heart besides the part that we know so well, that he was looking for that flag that morning. I'll wait until it gets passed around, because other words, I'll read these words and you'll go, huh? His English is a little different than ours today, so.
I wish they had chosen a different song.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
Not that easy.
It's a British tune. Not only was it didn't mention in there that the British tune happened, they actually know the writer of the tune, and it was a British tavern song, is what it was. So, not unlike what's the hymn we sing? "Mighty Fortress is Our God" is a German tavern song that people sang, and we've just seen with their weird signs, whatever the words originally were. But here we go. I think everybody's got one. "Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light, what so proudly we hail at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave? On the shore, dimly seen through the mists of the deep, where the foe's haughty host in dread silence reposes, what is that which the breeze over the towering steep, as it fitfully blows, half conceals, half discloses? Now it catches the beam of the morning's gleam of the morning's first beam, in full glory reflected now shines in the stream. 'Tis the star-spangled banner, oh, long may it wave, o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. And where is that band who so vauntingly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion, a home and a country, should leave us no more? Their blood has washed out their foul footsteps' pollution. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. And the star-spangled banner in triumph doth wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave. Oh, thus be it ever when free men shall stand between their loved home and the war's desolation. Blessed with victory and peace may the heaven-rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved us a nation. Then conquer we must when our cause is just, and this be our motto, in God is our trust. And the star-spangled banner in triumph shall wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave. Isn't it interesting that as he writes this, he recognizes the source of their victory over that, what does he call it, the band who vauntingly swore the havoc of war on us, that he recognizes it was the hand of the Almighty that created and preserved the nation. It's hard to imagine if that, you probably all studied the War of 1812 in history and you had to memorize those dates and everything, but we never realized how critical that war was, almost more so than the Revolutionary War that was fought before. Could have all been lost in that conflict there. So, interesting little bit of history. So you'll never sing the Star Spangled Banner again without seeing Francis Scott Key peering through the early morning dawn, wondering if that horrendous bombardment had just sealed the fate of their nation. One more demoralizing blow to the nation, one more success for Britain as they tried to redeem their military image, and God's grace in preserving us. So now you will never forget the words because you know the picture. Right? Anyway, so we are this morning still in 1 Kings, and we are in, I believe, 1 Kings 14 today. And we have pretty much pursued the track of Jeroboam and come to the end of following him through that track. He has, last Sunday we watched as he lost his son who was a successor to the throne because of his discipline, because of the direction that he took. That strange visit of his wife down, of all things, to the prophet. At a time when he didn't want to believe what the prophet told him when he said, if you don't turn around, I'm going to wipe you guys off the face of the earth and send you to the Gentiles. And he went, I'll still do my thing at the altar. And the altar breaks and the ashes spill out and his arm seizes up and he still goes, nah, I don't believe it. And then he sends his wife down there when his son is sick. So we saw that take place. And at the end of that, we have the summary in verse 19. Now the rest of the acts of Jeroboam, how he made war and how he reigned, behold, they are written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel. And at the time that Jeroboam reigned was 22 years, and he slept with his fathers, and Nadab, his son, reigned in his place. And it kind of leaves it there. Well, Nadab doesn't get to stay real long because there's going to be a revolt within the ranks, and we'll pick that up at a later time and follow that through as we begin to juggle the kings. And, I think Leroy mentioned last time, man, can you get a chart to keep these guys straight? And we will have one next time as we get into those. Who was when, and it gets so confusing and crossed up trying to figure out. And the names are the same. That's what just really blows your mind. It's this king in the north and this king in the south. They got the same names and different times they reigned, and you just go, ah. So we will have a chart in your hand that you can look at and be slightly less confused. But today I want to take a look at Rehoboam and begin to look at the southern kingdom. And we'll find it here. You also find in Chronicles is exclusively following Judah and the line through the kings of Judah. And so we'll be able to duck over there. You won't get much of the northern kingdom out of Chronicles except as the Judah kings are related to them somehow. So there's not a lot of history there we can follow. But Rehoboam is an interesting guy. We pick it up in verse 21. We've already seen some of his foolishness and his pride as he lost the 10 tribes. But now Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, reigned in Judah. And Rehoboam was 41 years old when he became king, and he reigned 17 years in Jerusalem, the city which the Lord had chosen from all the tribes of Israel to put his name there. And his mother name was Naamah the Ammonitess. The first things I want you to notice here is the fact that he's 41 when he starts. And if you do a little math, you will find out that he was born the year before his father ascended the throne. So he was alive all through the reign of Solomon. The reason that's important is because, one, when we're looking at the Proverbs and when they were written and why they were written, you have to realize that if they're early in his reign, he could have been probably maybe a teenager when those were written. So the possibility that we suggest that Solomon wrote those largely as a tool to try to reach his son would fit. That he probably could have been in that rebellious, crazy teenage time. The other thing is when you look at his reaction in losing those 10 tribes, he's not some 20-year-old kid just out of high school, if you will, that's just thinking he's pretty hot stuff. He's 41 years old. He's had time to figure out that he wasn't so hot, and he still hasn't gotten it. So it really helps you understand the pattern that's set in Rehoboam by the time he takes the throne. He's seen examples, but he's also been influenced by his father's decline. And his mother is mentioned. Yes. That is really interesting. There's very few of the northern kings' parentage other than the father is listed. Almost exclusively every single king of Judah, their mother is mentioned. And we talked about that on Mother's Day here, that moms are really important. Unfortunately, I think in a lot of the cases here, the moms were important because of what the difficulties they caused rather than the positive influence. So there are some that clearly have had a positive influence on their son as they stepped in and tried to turn the nation around. But in this case, she is called the Ammonitess. Did you catch that? It's not an Ammonitess. It is very specifically identifies her, or they looked at her, the writer looked at her as the Ammonitess. And there had to be numbers of them around, but she is the one. And it gives you a little clue, I think, to the influence she has and what kind of influence she has on this guy. That what she brings with us and the thing that's made her stand out is the fact that that's who she was and where she came from. And she probably brought things with her from that background. So all these little things that you kind of want to blow right over, as in the Star Spangled Banner video, you tend to, oh yeah, okay, you really got to stop and look at them and say, why is that in there? Why is that mentioned? Well, it tells us something about Rehoboam and what's going on. Now, in my old way of looking at things and trying to remember them, I always thought I remembered Jeroboam's the bad guy that caused all the havoc in the north, and Rehoboam was the good guy that stayed with Judah and followed the line through Christ, right? And then there is verse 22 that just throws a monkey wrench in the whole thing. And you go, wait a minute. And Judah did evil in the sight of the Lord. And they provoked him to jealousy more than all that their fathers had done with the sins which they committed. Wait a minute. These are the folks that all the Levites moved to Judah because they got run out of the northern tribes. They weren't welcome as priests up there because, remember, Jeroboam setting up his own priesthood he can control. Doesn't want those Levites in there. So they got ousted. All of those who were still faithful to Yahweh pulled up stakes and moved out, moved to Judah. They're down there having influence, and in spite of that, Judah provoked God's jealousy more than their fathers had done.
Maybe some of the reason that the peace came down was purely materialistic because they weren't being provided for any longer. So they may not have had a very good motive.
Good thought. I hadn't thought about that, but you're absolutely right. If they were pushed out of their ability to generate a living by the faithful bringing in their offerings and the gifts and all that sort of thing, yeah, they would not have had a way to survive. So just to physically live, they might have to go back where the temple worship and everything still took place. I hadn't considered that. Thank you. Very likely that maybe their religious influence wasn't as effective because they're just looking out for survival. So that may have been. And maybe we're seeing a little of that lack of influence as they proceed. And so you have to, what provoked him to jealousy is an interesting term that he uses, and God often uses that terminology when he's talking about his people Israel. Why jealousy? Why would God describe himself as being jealous?
Because of the
Idol worship. And of course we think jealousy is a sin, it's a bad thing. Obviously God doesn't sin, so as it describes him, we can't look at it from the sinful side. What is it that the idol worship, why would that so particularly bring on that term of jealousy?
It's just like us, when our loved one turns their loyalty to someone else, we're intensely jealous.
Right. Okay, so jealousy is connected closely to the husband-wife relationship in particular.
It's adultery.
It's what?
Adultery.
Adultery. It's that faithfulness, that bond between, that God set up, that's supposed to be between these two individuals, that somehow things have crept in and separated one from the other. So God's looking at it as though, and we see that description of Israel as his bride, it's his wife that he's been betrothed to, and she has turned and left him. And so when you see that, they've left him for, and it's not just walked away, there is no God. It's, oh, that's now my God. That's what I will worship. So that really, that's what it is kind of jealous, and using that term is they turned and they went. The sins that they committed were not just the fact that they were sinners, which we all are.
They were, in a sense, saying, like you hear sometimes farmers say, I don't love you.
I don't love you anymore, and I don't need you anymore, and I'm going to go over here and find my support, my happiness someplace else. Exactly. Exactly what they said to him. And then he explains in verse 23, this is how they did it. For they also built for themselves high places and sacred pillars, and asherim on every high hill and beneath every luxuriant tree. So they went out and set up alternative worship sites, just exactly like, only they brought in, which is interesting, they brought in more quickly, I think, from what I've seen. It really appears that they went out and brought these other gods, the Baal and Asherah, and these other gods of the Phoenicians and the Amorites and all the ites. And they brought them in and they installed them faster and more thoroughly within the nation of Judah than they did in Israel. In Israel, you see it come in, especially when Jezebel comes in. She brings the Baal worship big time with her. When she comes down from Phoenicia, she brings that with her. Up to that point, you've got Jeroboam's kind of phony, do-it-yourself Judaism. And they've got a religious system. They still have, remember when he had the altar that split and everything, you remember what they were celebrating? It was the Harvest Festival, the Tabernacles Festival, only 1 month later. It was just taking what we knew and was familiar, tweak it a little bit, bring in the bulls from Egypt to have something there to worship, and move it to another month, and try to keep a lot of the same religious type. We still have priests, we still have offerings, we have all that going on, just like you're familiar with a little, to take God out of it. And so we're doing that up north, and Jeroboam's promoting it like crazy. For the 21 years he's in there, he's pushing it.
Just like our folks today is just a little bit of truth, a little bit of everything.
Little thing else, yeah. Just a little, just take that little grain of what's familiar and true and move it over here and tweak it. And take the impact out of it. Well, Jesus is a nice guy. Let's take Jesus over here and make him a prophet. He's not quite God, he's not the Savior. Right? That's kind of what they've done. And God condemns them for it, says, you're going to be going into captivity because of that sin, because they've rejected him. But they were more, in fact, in Jeremiah, he said, these guys in the north were faithless. They just turned and walked away. You guys were treacherous because you pretended to keep the religious stuff going on in Jerusalem. They never missed a service. They never missed a festival. The Levites were still there. They're still doing their thing. And the temple worship is going on all the time. And when you read this, Judah did evil. The temple worship is still happening. It says, you're so treacherous. You truck down there, do your little offering thing in front of me, and then you go right over to the high hill and worship the Asherah and the Baals. Yeah.
Where are you reading?
I am looking right now at 1 Kings chapter 14 and verse 23. Okay?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Thanks. It's good that you asked that because sometimes I get way off track. So thanks for checking up with me. So we're on 23. He says that they went out and they built for themselves. King didn't even have to do it. They just went out. All he had to do was neglect to see that it didn't happen. And you'll see that over and over again. That the king fails to deal with that. Sometimes even when he reinstates or improves the worship at the temple, then they'll say, but he never removed.
Well, he grew up with that. Solomon was
He's already doing it. Solomon had broke the trail and he's no big deal. And then 24 pops in there and you go, what's that all about? So they had these things, and that there were male cult prostitutes in the land. They did according to all the abominations of the nations which the Lord dispossessed before the sons of Israel. Good heavens, what's that all about? That was part of the worship. In fact, one of my commentators says that term on here, it says male cult prostitutes, but it could be used either way for male or female. This stuff, interestingly enough, one of the things talks about persists all the way through into the Roman Empire. This worship of the nature goddess and the activities of the prostitutes. In fact, during the Roman rule, they had problems in some of their cities because these prostitutes, if you will, would come in also begging for money to support worship of the goddess. And of course, Rome, they had their own share of gods and goddesses, so, but they had problems with these people all the time out soliciting money to support this thing. So this deal is, he says, it's what we sent you in there for. I sent you in there to clean that stuff out, and you brought it all right back in. And see it. That's Rehoboam, the good guy, right? Is he or not?
They're celebrating right now.
Yeah. Now you wonder, what are we celebrating?
For this one month.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's and it's never left. It's still there. This was part of the nature worship. One of the ways that you cause nature to be fruitful and multiply and everything was to have this, you go in and have this relationship with a prostitute, and that's your worship, and that's what caused things to be renewed. Have a good spring, have a good harvest, have rain. It's nuts. We look at it and go, this is crazy. But that was there, and then you say it's still around. There's still the nature God worshippers are still out there. So he says, boy, this is a problem. This is where the nation's headed. Well, we're getting close to out of time, but I want you to see one little thing here, and then we'll pick it up here next time. That in the midst of the 5th year of King Rehoboam, he's got a problem. And I suspect, and others and the historians think that there is probably linkage to Jeroboam in this. Though you can't prove it, it never mentions it. But Jeroboam's just come from Egypt. and he is now up north. And you've read that we don't have any record of the actual battles, but there's warfare. There is strife between the two folks their whole reign. And it came about in the 5th year of King Rehoboam that Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. And he took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house, and he took everything, even taking all the shields of gold which Solomon had made. The Shishak came up, and boy, the historians are all over the map on this, but there's a bunch of them that are pretty consistent that there is really a Shishak, and his name is Shishonk, and there is a wall. Have you got that picture? It's hard to see here, but what that is a wall in the temple of Karnak in Egypt, and this is a wall that was part of that particular pharaoh's record of his accomplishments, and it's a little, I was hoping we could see it better, but even in the thing I was looking at, it's a little tough to see. But you can see here is a figure of the pharaoh, if you will. And then each one of these stones have these little cartouches on them, all these little symbols. And all of those are cartouches representing the cities and the places and the peoples that he's conquered. And within these, the experts tell us, are the names of a whole bunch of cities in Israel and their leaders. And they can go through the one that is not there, and they don't know if it's because it's one of these that's effaced and no longer there. Jerusalem is not included. However, you can go to Megiddo, and they were doing, if you remember, Megiddo was a place that Solomon built up, had a bunch of his horses there. And there's ruins there that demonstrate what they believe were probably stables, where he had his military established there in Megiddo. And they were doing some excavations in Megiddo, and they found the remains of a stele, or a rock deal with, where they put all they stand it up and put all their bragamony on it. And this guy shows up in Megiddo, and all the guys that said, "Oh no, this guy, he never went up there during that time. It's some other king. It's all confused. It's the wrong time." And all of a sudden, this guy right here has a stele with his claiming his victory over Megiddo and his superiority, and there's a little fragment of it that they have found. So this is the guy who came visiting, apparently, or looks pretty obvious that really did happen. And if you were good at Egyptology, you could go down and translate those little rascals, and there it is. So why does God let this guy come up there? Let's see, a little bit of discipline there. Why didn't the guy take out the whole thing? Was my question. Why did this guy from Egypt, he went through a whole bunch of cities. He really did quite a thorough job of going through and gutting the cities, got into Jerusalem, took the gold shields, and packed off all the treasuries out of the temple, practically bankrupted the country, I'm sure. Really cleaned them out, and all of a sudden disappeared. Why? Interestingly enough, in the history of this guy, when they went researching him, about that time it appears that he was up there fighting that battle. He had a revolt back home. And he had to hustle back to Egypt to try to put down the revolt. It appears that Israel was a stepping stone to Assyria and Babylon, who at that time were having their own political problems, and they were rather weak. And this king was very ambitious, and he decided he was going to move right up through Israel and go over and take Mesopotamia, go down the Euphrates, and he was going to be king of the world. And he got stopped right there, got that far through Israel, or through Judah, hadn't really got up and pushed. He was probably aiming for the other guys too. He just took his ambition just as far as God wanted him, and all of a sudden we got problems at home. Went back to try to settle problems at home and never came back.
But it just gets me because here Solomon put that one together and it didn't make one generation.
Didn't make it. And it's gone. The wealth of the nation is
Yeah.
stripped just like that. If you honor me, I'll honor you.
He must have had a formidable army because Jerusalem was not that easy. It was on this.
It was a tough spot,
fort,
yeah.
And he's fairly reasonable to defend.
Right.
And for him to just take it and keep everything in it, they must have just given up and left.
Yeah, it was.
I mean,
It was obvious. We'll go look at Chronicles next time, which gives us a more thorough review of it. You'll get to see a little more detail of what happened. But yeah, it was obviously the hand of God. That we're just right out of time, but I want you to see one last little thing. Look what King Rehoboam. This tells you so much about him if you listen as you read this. King Rehoboam made shields of bronze in their place and committed them to the care of the commanders of the guard who guarded the doorway of the king's house. And then it happened as often as the king entered the house of the Lord that the guards would carry them and would bring them back into the guard's room. You go, okay, no big deal. He lost his gold ones, so he made them out of bronze. And one of the guys says copper. I don't think it was copper. I think it was brass. You know why? Because if you shine up brass, I don't see anything here brass to shine. It's gold colored, just like gold ones. But the gold ones were put into the temple, the part of the house where it had the cedars of Lebanon. It called it the Forest of Lebanon. It was this public place where you went through, and they were proudly displayed in there. Did you notice where these go? They bring them out and they hold them as he goes to the temple, and they take them and they hang them up back in the house of the Forest of Lebanon, right? No, they take them and they carry them and they would bring them back into the guard's room. Why? So you can't tell the difference. Everybody thinks we still have these beautiful gold shields. We're still powerful. Don't come look at them close. We'll keep them hidden away in the armory back here. We no longer have them on display where you go, wow, the gold we got from. Tells you a little bit about this guy. His deceitfulness is wanting to cover up his power. But we are out of time. We're going to get invaded. Let's close with a word of prayer, and we try to think about so what. Father, we thank you for this time to take a little look into the insight into this guy Rehoboam and the state of the nation as he's ruling there. Father, the treachery of the nation of this king to try to play both ends of the game, to try to put on a religious face, to pretend to still be carrying on the faith that you had given them through Moses and through the law, through all that revelation, through the temple. The temple just only a few years before, built by Solomon, already raided of its treasures at such an early time, because they're playing this two-faced game. Father, help us to avoid that same kind of treachery, that pretending to be religious, pretending to be followers of you, and then at the same time pursuing the world. Father, help us to avoid that sin. May we stay faithful to you, and when you head us off the path and bring those folks to come up and shake our world, would you give us eyes to see and ears to hear, that would turn our hearts around and bring us back to you. Thank you for your grace that's given us this day. Thank you for this country that we can have, and those faithful men who saw your hand in the creation of it as we celebrate this week our independence and the founding of our country. May we appreciate not only the sacrifices of men, but the grace that you provided, that perhaps it might be a base for your word to go out through all the world. Pray that you would keep us about the business you called us to, and give you the praise and the glory.